Go for it.
This footnote is about a secondhand pair of $750 designer shoes that I bought, wore a handful of times, and then kept for nearly a decade.
Not relatable for me. Tell me about it.
So I was a shopaholic, as I said, for a really long time, probably from my early teens until my early 30s. And I used to be a huge follower of fashion blogs, especially like mid 2000s, before social media was really big. Fashion blogs were like the place to go for all the trends.
Yeah.
And this is embarrassing to admit because this influencer, I would have been, I don't know, in my late 20s, and she was probably like 19. But she had these shoes. They were Chloe heels. They were like big, clunky. I can't even describe them to you. I don't even have the words anymore. It's like so.
And I don't know the lingo,
Yeah.
so I wouldn't even be able to.
It's like so far from what my life is now. But she wore them and I was obsessed. And I think they were like the it shoe at the moment.
Okay.
Because they were secondhand on eBay. I bought them from Germany for $750.
Far out.
I know. And to clarify, I was not in a financial position where I was like, oh yeah, $750 for a pair of shoes. Like, that was not me. So I shouldn't have bought these shoes. And they were such an it item that after I bought it, like 10 minutes later, I was getting messages on eBay from people trying to buy them from me, right? They were like,
wow.
So cool, which is like painful to say. So I got them and they were ridiculous.
Ridiculous.
Like, I used to live in Tassie. So I lived in Hobart, right? And I've got these like 6-inch heels. I'm like, and I don't go out to like clubs. I'm like, what am I going to do with these shoes? So I would wear them like shopping at Kmart.
So Tasmanian Kmart.
Yeah.
In these really expensive designer shoes.
Like, I don't know. I wore them only a handful of times. And if you had asked me, I would have told you how much I adored these shoes, how they were a brilliant purchase, how like every penny I spent was well worth it because these shoes were so amazing.
Yeah.
And of course I didn't wear them that often. Like after I wore them the first few times, nobody wants to reach for a pair of like 6-inch heels to like pop down to the shops, right? I always found reasons to wear other shoes. But if you had asked me for, I don't know, I think I maybe kept them for maybe 7-8 years. My story throughout that 7-8 years was always, I love these shoes. They're perfect. Like, I just never have a chance to wear them. Like, if I just had a better social life, if I had more things to go to, I would wear these shoes all the time.
Yeah.
But the problem is not the shoes. The problem is that, like, I just need more occasions to wear these shoes.
Yeah.
And so it was not until, like, I kept them. I had started embracing minimalism, decluttering. I had decluttered over 80% of my belongings.
Wow.
I think at this point I had downsized, that I was living in this teeny tiny studio that didn't even have a kitchen and a bathroom. We shared those down the hall. I had a tiny Toyota Echo and everything we owned fit into our car. But I still had these shoes and I stubbornly held on to the problem. Like, they were not clutter. They sparked lots of joy. And like, I just needed more occasions to wear them. And it's so funny because I think that sometimes storytelling is really powerful. And as we tell a story, like, the truth comes out of our mouth, whether we realize it or not. So I was ironically writing this decluttering guide for my website, and I'm thinking about these shoes, and it hits me that it's not the money. Like, I don't love these shoes. It is the shame that I felt for not only spending the money on the shoes. It was almost less about the money.
Yeah.
It was how I was so easily influenced by a teenager into thinking that I needed these shoes, like, that I fell for basically everything that the marketing world tells you, right? That's some like $700 pair of shoes that I don't have any occasion to wear for, like, that I just fell for all that messaging. And the shame that I felt about that kept me from acknowledging anything, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when I was at my peak shopaholic period, I kind of knew deep down that it was a problem, right? Like, I am spending a fortune. I think one of the low points before I started to make changes, I had gone to Bali for like 2 weeks with friends on like a girls' trip. And I spent multiple thousands of dollars on clothes. And, you know, like in Bali, it's not that expensive. I brought home.
How did you spend multiple thousands of dollars in Bali?
I went to
clothes?
like, it's wild. And the thing is, like, almost all of it was unwearable when I got home. It was like stuff you wear on the beach. And back then I was living in Tasmania, right?
Oh, wow.
Like, I'm not going to wear like a crochet mini dress when I'm in like a, you know, climate that barely ever sees, you know, above 15 degrees. So, but, sorry to go off topic, but at that period when I was like peak shopaholic, I would have told you how much I loved it. Like I made that part of my identity as like self-protection. Like I can see that now. Like pretend it's like I don't know, like another thing, I guess insecurity is like a common theme throughout all my clutter. When I was in my early 20s, I was always the type to like break up with a guy before he broke up with me. You know what I mean? Like if I hooked up with some guy, I was always going to leave. I didn't want him to leave me, like so I could protect myself. So I can see now it was very much that way with the shopping. Like pretend, I remember seeing this thing in my Facebook memories, and it's that whole like, life is short, buy the shoes, right? And I can see the year, and that's when I can see, like, I knew I was miserable, I was in debt, but I'm, like, putting off, like, hey, everybody, like, look how happy I am because of all these shoes that I have. And it kind of trails back to this $700 pair of shoes that, honestly, probably the last 5 or 6 years that I owned it, I never wore it. And, like, deep down, I knew the truth that, like, you need to sell these shoes, right? And the real, like, practical level, it was like, oh, good Lord, waiting 7 years to sell an it pair of shoes is not a good idea because they are no longer an it pair of shoes.
Yeah. Were they at least, like, retro or vintage by that time?
I think I sold them for, like, $50 or something. It was, like, so painful.
Oh.
But kind of, like, the lesson is that, not that I think we're, like, intentionally lying to ourselves, but how even as I was sort of going down this path of minimalism and decluttering, how this desire to protect yourself is so strong and how it kept me from seeing that I made this mistake. And, you know, once I sort of realized it, then I could see it repeated in all sorts of things. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was actually teaching a live version of one of my decluttering programs.
Yeah.
And like the month before had been my birthday, and I lived next to one of the best secondhand shops on earth, right? And so I went in there and I bought like 8 things. It cost me like nothing. They were all like really good quality, really good brands, but things I know I'm not going to wear, right? And yet, even though I was teaching a decluttering course, I kept telling myself, oh, I just haven't had the chance to wear them, right? I just haven't had the chance. And again, it was in teaching the course and telling people, I was like, oh, I actually just feel ashamed because I should know better. Right? When you're like a teacher, you should know better. And so again, I just think it's just the sneaky way that our clutter manifests, and that the problem that you think it isn't always the real problem. Like the problem that you can articulate, like, oh, it was so expensive, or, oh, I have nowhere to wear it, or I love it. And that may be true, but there's often something else underneath.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just a lesson learned, right?
Yeah. So it's not something that you haven't done anything like that since, have you?
Not to that big scale.
Yeah.
Like not spending $700 on a pair of shoes, but I still catch myself making, I don't want to call them mistakes, right? But just like decisions that weren't necessarily the best, right? We all do it. Like we're humans. And on a quick side note, I think that there's some periods in our life where we have to make mistakes more often.
Yeah.
Like thinking again about clothes, after I had my first child, I had to completely learn how to dress again for my body, right? So like I don't feel like those were a shameful, or like I bought tons of clothes that I maybe just wore one time and it's like, no, this does not work for me anymore. I've got to get rid of it.
Yeah.
So less talking about that, more sort of talking where, you know, I'm very mindful of the emotional triggers that are shopping, but I still do it, right? Because I'm a human being.
Yeah.
And so, but what I find is that my first instinct is often to make some other kind of excuse. until I kind of like really poke around at my feelings and then realize actually you're just feeling, it's often shame. Like shame is such a painful feeling that we will pretend it's anything else to avoid feeling shame. And I think that's a huge one with clutter. Like even, you know, we talked about in another conversation about people will say, I can't declutter because I'm worried about waste, right?
Yeah.
And that is a valid concern, totally.
Yeah.
But sometimes you don't even really mean it.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to say that.
Sometimes it's just an excuse.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to be rude. Like, I understand it. As I was saying, like, I do these kind of things myself. But sometimes you got to call out yourself and just say, well, that sounds a lot better, doesn't it? Like, it sounds a lot better to say, hey, I'm not decluttering this because I'm worried about waste, versus actually, I'm not decluttering this because I'm so freaking ashamed that I have wasted so much money on things that I've never worn. Like, I have experienced during my shopaholic days, and I've worked with clients who told me there's been times when I'm in the shop and I am at the counter buying something and I already know it's a mistake. And I just go through with it anyway. And like, you know,
that's heavy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, it's easier to kind of say, oh, you know, I love it. I just never wear it. Right?
Yeah.
So just, yeah, it's just so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Like, the whole reason that I do the work that I do is because I'm just fascinated by our relationship with clutter and what it can teach us about ourselves. And yeah, it's just, it is one of the greatest personal development journeys that I've gone on in terms of self-discovery and having to realize, here's all your bullshit. This is all the like bullshit that you're telling yourself, right? And now I'm like calling myself out on it.
That's the way clutter can speak to you.
Yes.
It reveals the inner depths of your soul, and it's like you have to confront this thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it's like, I think that is what's missing, you know, from so many conversations, is that, like, the way that I put it is, if you know all the decluttering tips and all the decluttering hacks, right? So many people I work with have read like every book out there.
Yeah.
They could write their own book. They know like all the tips. They know everything that they are supposed to do, but they cannot follow through. And sadly, is they think it's them. I'm a lazy person. If I could just stop procrastinating. Whereas, like, so many of these women are the least lazy people I've ever met in my life. But they think it's like, I'm not trying hard enough. When the reality is, like, you just need a bit of, like, I call it compassionate curiosity. That's kind of my phrase word for dealing with your clutter. You need to be curious, but in a compassionate way.
Yeah.
And as you start playing around with that, you start, like, unraveling your attachment to clutter.
Yeah. And it's so true. It's like compassionate curiosity. It's a way to connect with other people, but it's something that we far too infrequently turn onto ourselves. And it's so important when we're looking at clutter in the context of all of this social messaging that says clutter bad equals you bad.
Yes.
and
well, it's like even telling you this story, right? And like, I can have a bit of a laugh, and I know that you aren't judging me, but there is like a slight horror now. Even though I have told this story many a times, to be like, yeah, I bought a $750 pair of shoes that I wore a few times. And there's probably like people who like, not even consciously judging. Like, I'm sure people who listen to your podcast are, you know, a bit more open-minded and things, but like, there's still that kind of like gasp, like, like, oh my goodness.
Which is so ironic, given that we live in such a hyper-capitalistic society that says consume, 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 but not like that.
Oh my God, you don't get me started on this topic. No, in all seriousness, do you want me to talk about that?
Maybe not this time.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a subject we can dive into another time.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you for letting me just spill my thoughts on the air.
That's the way we like it.